and just said, look, I don't think you want to do this for the rest of your life. You seem smart. You should go to school. You should do something. And back then, Newberry College was on Boylston Street. And so, they didn't teach you about student loans and things like that. So I walked in and they were all too eager and happy to sign me up. And the rest is sort of history. So Newberry College back then was only a 2-year institution. After I left there, someone said, hey, you should get a job at Suffolk University. And if you do, then you can go to school. And I did that. And I ended up finishing and graduating from Suffolk. And then naturally went into law school right after that. So I'm a double ram, but I've been in Boston in the area since I was 17, essentially raised myself, and by the grace of God had some other people that he brought into my life that looked out for me. One of my best, memories of Linda White was just really, I had a woman that I was working with and I was couch surfing and she let me use a spare room in her house. But she had a cat and I was like really deathly afraid of the cat. And so she helped me get my name on some lists, and I ended up getting a subsidized house, a studio apartment on not Boylston, but St. Botolph Street in Boston. But Linda knew that I was going to school. I was working 2 jobs. I didn't really have a lot. So every once in a while she would come, she would ring the buzzard, she would show up with buckets of pennies and say, look, let's just roll the pennies. Wow. And we put our name on it, and she would drive me over to the Star Market in Fenway Park. And we would buy groceries, and she was one of the people in my life who just looked out for me and always checked on me. And, in life, you need people like that.
Absolutely.
You need them to make sure you stay on the right path. You need them to make sure the right people come into your life. And you need them to make sure that you stay grounded. And it curbs a lot of things like depression, mental health issues. I mean, if you know that you're in a community where people love you, care about you, think about you, are looking for you, and checking up on you, you're more inclined to do the things you need to do, but also you're more likely to do right.
It's interesting you talk about to do right. And as you shared some of your story, I was really, I see here on your website, it says you built your life here. And you talked about some of that, but your grandmother, Flora Mae Champion, taught you resilience, discipline, and the importance of expecting more from life. So that came even,
Yes. So that's the foundation, right? So my grandmother raised me in church. And so one of her things, she would say, look, if you can go out to the game on Friday night, you can get up and go to church, right? So she was an amazing human being. I met her when I kind of transitioned in and out of gypsy foster care systems. And so I was in a system where my sister had given birth to a little girl, and my sister was 13 at the time. And so I went to a foster care system with the baby. But as my niece started to get older, the foster care parents who wanted to adopt her were very concerned that I would tell her true identity, like who her mother really was, and they wouldn't be seen as her parents. And so they then found my father's mother. And I was living in the bayou, in the Louisiana bayou, in Louisiana, in a town called Sunshine, Louisiana. They tracked down and found my father's mother in Longview, Texas. And so one morning they put me on a bus, and I got off a bus and met a woman who said she was my grandmother. And I lived with her until I was about 15. 16, and then I heard that my mother had come back to the United States, and she was in Massachusetts. And, I think what happens is when you're a kid who grows up in a foster care system, or even if you're an adoptee, you have a natural desire to want to be with your parents. You have a natural desire to want to know where you belong. And I was no different. And once I had an opportunity when I was 17, I, packed what little I had and came in search of my mom.
Wow, what an amazing story. So your very interesting background. I see that you said you're fortunate to have been raised by both a Black grandmother and by your Korean immigrant mother's example of hard work. You talked about the military experience in Vietnam and so forth. Is this your father?
Yes. So my father was one of the first Black military police officers. He was in Vietnam in 1969. He met and married my mother in 1970 because that was, when the soldiers transition in and out of their deployment stations. His base, so to speak, was South Korea.
Wow.
So he was stationed in South Korea, and then he would go to Vietnam. So he was in the war for 69 and didn't come back to the United States until about 73. But the thing with my father is he was an expert marksman. He was a sharpshooter. And so he came back to the United States with a lot of scars and a lot of damage. Now, today, we understand the effects that war has on people. But back then in the 70s, we didn't understand those things. But what I think my father wasn't prepared for is one, returning to the United States as a Black man in the Deep South with a Korean wife and mixed race kids. And I think that might have been just a little bit much. But also, it's one thing when you're in South Korea and you have access to translators and people who can interpret, but bringing my mother to the United States and not being able to communicate or speak the language that she spoke was very difficult.
Wow. So with that diverse background, how do you feel with Boston being such a diverse city? And you talked about how expensive it is to live here. And so we know that structural systems of oppression are real, right? Classism, racism, sexism, phobia, right? So those are real things and it's interesting with all those things that you had to navigate, being homeless, being and that diverse background and those structural systems in place. How what would you attribute to being the thing that you did not revert to crime? Because I mean, again, people sometimes unfortunately steal or get into illicit behavior because of they're trying to provide.
It's interesting because my grandmother said, used to always say, a closed mouth don't get fed, right? She would say it all the time. And I think that for me, I'm very clear with people about whatever it is I need. I don't know if that is helpful or if it's not, right? But some people, I think, come to a space with a lot of pride. So people will say, how are you doing today? Is there anything you need? And people will say, no, I'm good. But in reality, they're not good, right? And so all of us probably know of someone who has taken their own life, So I think about the times when I have a friend, she had what appeared to me everything in the world, right? She had beautiful children. She had a beautiful grandbaby. She had a husband. She had just built a new house. She ran the Boston Marathon. She was active. Had just seemed to have it all. And, and I wake up one morning and they tell me that she hung herself. And so you sit and you think like, well, what did I miss, right? I really think that for me, because I was raised by my grandmother, Flora Mae Champion, in the church, at St. Mark's Methodist Church, like we went to church. It was a big part of my life. Prayer is a big part of my life. The belief that God doesn't bring me to places to drop me off a cliff and let me fall apart. A belief that there's more expected of me, that he gave me a crystal clear mind. He gave me the ability to communicate. He gave me the ability to have certain senses about me and common sense. And he gave me the ability to help others. And so for all those things, and each of us have our own gifts, right? I mean, I wish I had Whitney Houston's gift, right? I wish I had Bruno Mars's gift, but I wasn't given those gifts. I was given other gifts. And all, I'm 53 years old now. And so for a long time, I used to fight against that. I used to be like, why do I have to do it? And why do I have to help so much? And I'm so tired, right? And then one day I realized that because that is the cross I bear. Everyone has their own thing, but that's the cross I've been given. That's the task I've been given. My task is to take the skills and the gifts that I have and to make sure that I help people in whatever capacity they present themselves to me. My job is to make sure that I am helpful. When I was a member and used to go regularly to Jubilee, Bishop used to say it differently. He used to say, be a blessing. Like, be a blessing to people. And, and he'd always say these things like, you got to clean up your own house, and cleaning your house means cleaning up your finances, cleaning up your, your physical space, cleaning up, the drama, the things that kind of weigh you down in life. And, so hearing those things, I take that really to heart, so when I come and I'm in spaces, I don't really get into all the nonsense, right? I just want to know, okay, what do we need to do? How are we going to do it? And is that something I can do on my own? Is that something that I need help with, that we need to do collectively as a team or a group? But either way, we have to leave spaces better than the way we found them. If it's a mess when we got there, we can't just walk out and turn a blind eye to the mess. And so that's kind of how I feel about this race, right? It's a mess. The Suffolk County District Attorney's Office is a mess.
And why would you say that?
Because you can't lead and serve people if they don't trust you. And the community has a lack of trust in that position. The law enforcement officials have a lack of trust in the person who holds the position. And so now you have two problems. You have a community that distrusts that system, and you have people working within the system who distrust the current district attorney. And that is not something, trust is once broken, is not easily repaired. And so I don't know how an individual, right, can come to a place where they can lead and be an effective leader if they have so many spaces that are now broken. Now, it doesn't mean that individual, because you have another person in the race who says, look, I want to come back in, give me another shot. It doesn't mean that people make mistakes and people can't be restored, or people can't go back into spaces and still be leaders and still be effective, right? But timing also plays a factor in that. And right now, in my opinion, it's the wrong time for the current district attorney. It is the wrong time for the person who was the former district attorney. And it is time for us to just have a clean slate and to go forward in a direction, in a way that makes more sense, without the drama, without the controversy, without the, I really don't care what you did. None of my business, right? What you did. I'm not judge and jury. But what I can tell you is what you did and what you have the capacity to do, and what we see in you as an individual. That scares me. And it is for those reasons we need to move forward with new leadership.
And what would be different in your leadership in this moment? What would you do differently?
There's a lot of things that I would do differently, but let me give you an example.
Please.
The current district attorney recently arraigned a doctor who was charged with, or it was alleged that he had sexually assaulted a number of women. We saw on April 26th the doctor being arraigned in the Suffolk County Superior Court on 81 counts. So those 81 counts were attributed to different women, right? But those complaints came out in 2023. So what took you so long to believe what happened to those women? So I would have done that differently, right? When you have a large number of people coming forward telling you, my doctor hurt me, my doctor sexually assaulted me, I am sick, I am fragile, I don't know what to do. And you then take all of that and wait for almost 4 years to help those women get to a point where they can begin their own healing process. That's something I won't do. The other thing I won't do is not staff the office properly. So of all those victims, there was one advocate for every 30 of them. Does that seem logical? Even as a minister, even as a person who works, even the nurses right now are on a picket line saying, we need four patients per nurse. How do you have 30 victims of a violent sexual crime committed against them with one person helping them through that process, the emotional journey of it? So that's something that I would do differently. For his predecessor, she had a case where multiple women came forward and said, this former prosecutor, this assistant district attorney who is your friend, who you are on TV with hugging and kissing in a Netflix video, gave me a sexually transmitted disease without my knowledge, permission, or consent. He essentially raped me. And instead of submitting all of that evidence to the grand jury, she sent it to her friends, to a private firm, and then came back and said, thank you so much for coming forward with this information. But my friends at this private law firm said it wasn't consensual. Sorry for the outcome. That's not right. That's something I would do differently. I would submit their criminal complaints and give it to the proper people to do the investigation. I think it is a crime to knowingly have sex with a woman and give her an incurable sexually transmitted disease without her knowledge, permission, or consent. And so that's where she and I will disagree. But so there's a lot of things I would do differently. The other thing is, everyone within this community celebrated a list of the top 15 things I'm not going to prosecute. That was the list.
Okay.
Those top 15 things single-handedly caused the elimination of pharmacies in our community. You know what the elimination of pharmacies does to our seniors? That they can't go and walk to a store and get their medication, life-saving medication sometimes. But it's another thing, because I was the prosecutor in the Elders and Persons with Disabilities unit. I was the prosecutor looking at financial exploitation of our seniors. So now you have cut off their lifeline to a pharmacy that they can walk to. Now they got to give a stranger, a home health aide, or a nurse, or some other person their personal confidential information. Why? Because they don't know how to get on the internet and order their medication. So now you have now opened them up and created an opportunity for fraud to be committed against them. And so these are, sometimes things sound good, right? But you really have to look at, okay, this sounds good, but what is the impact of that? We've seen that many times before in other spaces. Think about it. Education, separate but equal. It wasn't equal. Sounded good, but wasn't equal, right? And so what we have to do is look at when we set policies and when we set an agenda that the entire community has to be a part of, we have to make sure that the impact isn't going to be more damaging than a good idea.
Absolutely. With that said, many people believe that there should be a balance between accountability. You talked about not prosecuting low-level 15 offenses. I'm curious what those were for those who maybe didn't see what those were. Could you list what they are?
Some of them were like, no, that she wasn't going to prosecute for shoplifting. There would be no prosecution for certain breaking and entering, so people could break into your house or break into your car. And if those things were based on need, there would be no prosecution. Certain drug dealing and drug-related offenses weren't going to be prosecuted. But the reality is you can't really have a blanket list. Everybody is different. Every case and person is unique. Some stuff, certainly I was a prosecutor, so I was the person in Dorchester down the street carrying a caseload of 700 to 800 cases. I don't want those cases if they're not going to go anywhere, right? So you have to, as a prosecutor, look at the case and say, look, do I have a victim? If I have a victim, is the victim seeking to testify? Are they on board with this case? Because there were oftentimes people, and so in communities of color, we don't have the resources that other communities have. So what I mean by that is this. So often people use 911 as a lifeline, like to help them. But sometimes what they're reporting is simple stuff, right? So my brother hit me with the phone. But once the police are called and they're dispatched to that location, they have to act. And we take seriously domestic violence, right? So once the police are there and they see that, yes, your brother hit you with the phone, and they see a scar or bruising, or, maybe they cut you open, right? They can't just say, oh, kids just fight, right? That's what they do. If your siblings, you fight with your siblings, right? And they're gonna make an arrest. They have to, right? For the safety of not only the individual, but your worst fear is that you do nothing. and you leave the people in the space. And then that person is even now more mad that you called the police, and now you have an outcome that you didn't want. So they're going to take the safe approach, and there's probably going to be a separation. And sometimes that separation could be someone goes to jail and I see them in the courtroom and we're ready to arraign them. But what I ask myself and what I look at is, you shouldn't be arraigning people or doing anything to a person if it's something that you don't do. So I always ask the young prosecutors, well, did you fight with your brothers and sisters? And they'd say, yeah. So what did your parents do? Oh, they sent us to camp, or they'd send us to therapy. Well, that's great. But there are certain communities that don't have the money and the resources to do that. And so not that we want to be social workers or mental health professionals as prosecutors, because that we're not trained for that. But what we have to use is some level of common sense so that we're not creating and building records for young people when they are just doing something that everybody does. It's no different. Every household and every person who has a sibling in this country has had a fight with their sibling. Unless they're like a saint. Maybe Jesus never fought with his siblings, but most people have had fights with their siblings.
Absolutely. So how do you balance, again, accountability, right? As well as understanding trauma, understanding people who, this whole matters, right? That the brain is not even fully formed, right? Until 25, and the impulse and the community environments and the people not being in the home and all the kind of precursors that put people sometimes, poor communities, right? Over policed, over sentenced. Many instances could be out on bail, but don't have the resources to get out on bail. So they're waiting. I know people 3, 4, 5 years waiting pre-trial at the House of Correction and being further traumatized while they're going through this process of, of custody and care, even dying at the hands of correctional officers.
Well, there's a lot of things that happen particularly when people get incarcerated. So one of the most egregious is, and people, I see it and people don't talk about it enough. People are always talking about addiction to things like drugs, right? Heroin. So when someone is withdrawing from that, kind of what that looks like. But there are other things that people can be addicted to, like alcohol, and people can withdraw from alcohol and die from that. And so I think that the jails, whether it's, someone is being temporarily held in a particular space before they're transported somewhere else. I think that the justice system has to do a better job that once they take you into their care, custody and control, that the care component of it is not lost. I think that what happens is, and one of the reasons I am a big proponent of, if someone is incarcerated, they are not subjected to additional things that it's like a collateral consequence of the incarceration. We didn't intend for you to be cruelly and abused and punished. We just intended for you to say, hey, you committed this crime. This is the punishment, right? But that punishment should not subject you to other things. And what are those other things? One of the things I think is that it's okay to give people their own room if they do have to be incarcerated. I think it's abusive to make you share a room with someone you don't know, right? Because that creates a different level of trauma. So now I did something wrong. I'm going to be held accountable. Now, not only am I going to be held accountable, I don't get to sit with my own thoughts and myself and figure out what the next step is for me and how I want to make right the wrong. I now got to navigate this other personality, this other person, all of their moods, mannerisms. And I think those are things that can create unsafe and toxic spaces. And now it changes sort of the personality of the person. So sometimes I think the way that the system is configured, it can actually make people worse coming out than when they went in, right? What I will say is we have a lot of work to do. And no one person can do all of the work. And I certainly do not have all the answers, right? But I have family members who have been incarcerated. I have family members who some cycle in and out. Some have served life sentences. And the thing that I always say, and one of the things that I really appreciated about the former Norfolk County sheriff, is that he created a room for visiting so that when children came to visit, they didn't feel like they were in prison. And I think that making sure that people, when they are being held accountable, we are not causing other people to suffer the same sentence. And I get really concerned when children have to suffer the same sentence. Children are innocent. They have the right to the love and affection of their parents, regardless of where they are. They have the right to know that people care for them. They have the right to not feel like they were different, because I remember growing up without my parents, and, kids make a big deal about that. They're like, oh, nobody wants you. You don't have kids. You don't have parents, things like that. So I want to make sure that children, when they go, if they do have a parent that's incarcerated, have the ability to see them and interact with them in a normal setting that is not punitive to the child. And that child can have the love and affection of their parent, and they have something to look forward to. But vice versa, the parent who's incarcerated, if they have the ability to build that relationship and have the love and affection of their children, they too have something to look forward to. It's one of the reasons why I worked with Leslie Creedle to create and start the Justice for Housing program. Worked very hard to break down barriers so that women who were returning could be reunited with their children, because to be reunited, you have to have stable housing. It's a big component of the work. And also working on pilot programs with the Boston Housing Authority to eliminate the stigma and break down barriers so that people who were formerly incarcerated could come back into community, and could be a part of their children's lives and have their children come home, essentially. But they could do that without hardship, and they could do that eliminating those barriers that were in place, like you can't have a voucher because you have a past criminal record. Once they've served their debt to society, it has to be finished. And, even when I'm out in community and I meet people and they'll say things to me like, oh, well, I just want to tell you I was formerly incarcerated. And I'm like, why do they say that? It means nothing. It means nothing to me, in that I'm not judging you based on anything you did, and that's not the label you wear for the rest of your life. You have a name, you have dreams, you have aspirations. We can start there, because once you come back home, you've paid your debt, and we just all need to move forward.
In that same vein, I appreciate you stating that your conviction, that is not who you are. Whether it's a misdemeanor, whether it's a felony, you're not a felon, you're not a misdemeanor, you're a human being
who makes mistakes.
Correct. So with that said, in the context of voting, we are working aggressively. Senate Bill 524, it sits in the Ways and Means Committee right now, and we're aggressively trying to restore the right for the thousands of people who've been disenfranchised since 2000, who were stripped the right of voting if you're presently serving a felony conviction. Do you support universal voting rights restoration across the board?
I support voting rights. So the thing is this, whether you are incarcerated or whether you are at home, right? If you are a citizen, you should have the right to vote, period. You have the right to participate in a process that elects the people who put and control laws that impact your life.
Correct.
It's very important.
Correct.
And maybe if everyone votes, which they don't, but everyone needs to vote. So you got to all vote so that we can start to change things, and we can hold people accountable who are using taxpayer dollars to put in place systems. Some of these systems and policies, they just don't work anymore. Some of them may have been well intended, like you can shoplift and not be prosecuted. Sounds well intended, doesn't work, because it's not helpful to us, for any of us, to go into a store and have to ring a bell to get our personal goods. That feels more offensive to me than me having a child who's doing, or a young person doing what they're not supposed to be doing, and bringing them in and putting in place some measures of accountability and saying, look, we got to do better here. What I would love for our community to do, and what our children to do, because someone called me the other day and they said, well, we just need to give these kids jobs. And I said, I don't think so, because jobs alone mean nothing, right? If you have a job and it's a menial job, okay, so you get up, and I worked at McDonald's as a manager, and I remember I loved me some McDonald's. I just wanted to become a store manager, and they would just always say no. They just wanted me to work drive-through, right? Because why? Because they saw me as a young Black girl, and I didn't have what they thought was, the person who should be their store manager. And granted, I was really young at the time, and so my aspirations, at 18, 19 may have been really high. But the reality is this. I had a dream. So I was working at McDonald's because I wanted to go to college, and I needed money to go to college because I wanted to be a lawyer, right? So you can't have children who have no ability to figure out what they like, what their dreams are. We've taken everything away from them. We've taken away music education. We've taken away arts education. You've even taken away PE. We used to be able to go and play sports and dodgeball or something. You've taken away so much, and then you've taken away all the space, the outdoor space in which they could use to kind of run or play or do anything. And then you say, go get a job. What are they getting a job for? They don't even know what their dreams are. They don't even know what they're good at. They don't even know what their interests are, because they've not had the ability to be exposed to it. They don't know if they love photography or music. They don't know if they love, computers and technology. We have taken away from children whose parents don't have resources, the ability to explore and be children, the ability to dream and have motivation to work towards something. So sure, you can give them a job, but if they have a job and there's nothing behind the job, no motivation, no dream, no aspirations, then you're going to still find yourself in the same position. We have to get our kids back to a place where they know and can realize their full potential. And that's an approach that requires everyone. And it does require that we invest in our communities and in our children.
With that said, again, for those as a district attorney, right? So for the Suffolk County, right? So for those whom, again, have situations and circumstances that have been less than ideal, in fact, extremely bad circumstances, indoctrinated into gangs because of poverty and those kinds of things, and then by their parents, like culture, right? And now they're incarcerated. All those things you talked about, programming and education and the arts and so forth, do you think those are things that should be in custody and care within the Suffolk County for those who are now incarcerated with accountability? You talked about, you think they should have rooms by themselves, but again, there's things that they could be trained, right? That are marketable skill sets,
yes,
to run the facility, that could be transferable to come back into community, that you're then able to be economically sustained. You talked about how expensive it is, right? So there's a program right now at the Nashua County Jail called the Evolve program. That's a model program that's really about custody and care, dealing with therapy. It's dealing with all those things, like the issue of unlively behavior, particularly if you're talking about young people, right, whom didn't have that stable environment. And we, again, now scientifically, your brain's not even formally formed. Now they're thrust into these situations, and there's not custody, there's not care. So I'm curious, in the Suffolk County, I think we have an opportunity to create a model, right, that we could replicate across the Commonwealth. We've got models in Norway and other places that do custody and care. So I just be curious to hear.
Sure. I mean, I talk to people all the time. One individual that I talk to every day, and in fact just left coming here, is Trucy Allah. And Trucy, serves as my director of policy. And he put together, this amazing model that he wanted to do with respect to community engagement and how to work with young people. Now, because I'm, in 2018, I would probably be on every station just telling everybody everything, right? But I learned from that race that you have to be careful all the things you say because they steal it all. Like the next thing you know, they'll be like rolling it out and it's their idea. So, I'm mindful of that, but I think that there are ways that we can do some really good work. The district attorney controls a $28 million budget. Not all of that budget needs to go to salaries, right? And so within his own sort of upper command, so the sixth floor is what we would call it. Most of those individuals are probably making all over $150,000 a year, which is a considerable amount of money considering that he also gives them a car and free parking and all these other perks. Most of the individuals that serve in his administration at the highest levels do not even live in Suffolk County. They're not even from Boston. And so I think the way you start to change things and you start to change programming is you start to put in place people who actually need this to work. They need change so that they too can go home safe. They too can feel comfortable with the schools they send their children to. They too feel comfortable driving down the street at 2:00 in the morning without any hesitation, right? And so it's easy to prosecute a community when you don't live in the community. It's easy to lord your authority and weight over someone when there's no repercussion back to you, right? Because you get to go to Saugus at night, or you get to go to Newton at night, or, and even in the current DA's situation, he gets to send his kids to his house on Martha's Vineyard all summer. They don't have to be caught up in the riffraff of what's going on in these streets. And so not everybody has those luxuries. And so we need people who can serve that are similar in our ability to do the things we need to do, and similar in where we live and how we live and what we're asking and expecting of others, and also making sure that our budgets reflect the priority and the needs of the community.
With that said, again, you talked about folks living within the community and being so correctional officers. I want to go back to correctional officers because that's inside the houses of correction, and two high profile,
which has a sheriff for, right? But I don't really control the house of correction. But
I'm getting somewhere. There's a correlation between the Suffolk County District Attorney and the Suffolk County Sheriff.
Yes.
And the relationship, a healthy relationship, could change the trajectory of what the outcomes that we're experiencing, right? So I'm just trying to make that connection, because as a prosecutor, right, that's working with the place that then it's doing custody and care, there is a direct relationship, right? And so as you're talking about programming and making the models more, right, or encouraging that, you do the sentencing, right? You'll be the attorney general overseeing the cases within the Suffolk County.
Sure. So what happens is when an individual pleads guilty, so to speak, or if a jury renders a verdict of guilty, the judge will hear both sides as to sentencing. So, they'll hear the Commonwealth on sentencing, and they'll hear the defense bar on sentencing. One of the things that is tricky, especially at the district court level, where you're going to see a bulk of your cases cycling in and out, right, is that everything happens instantaneous. So the jury comes back in, they give you their verdict. The judge says, "I'll hear you on sentencing." And what I would like to see is, to your point, especially as it relates to when people are incarcerated, that there be a little pause and the defense bar and the prosecution, the Commonwealth, conference the case so we can look at, because you got to remember, the prosecutor is blind to the individual on the other side. They don't get to talk to them. They don't know them. All they see is what's in a file. And so I think that we have an opportunity to change at least one thing where we can pause for a second. Judge, can we step this case back? And that there be a little bit of a mandate that the two sides talk. Because what do we want? We have our common interest at that point is we want this individual to never have to come back into this courtroom again. And so there has to be a conversation that says, what's going to work for her? what's going to work for him, right? Or whichever pronoun they identify with, right? So what's going to work? And then once you have that conversation, then you could do a couple things. You could advance a sentence that is mutually agreed upon, right? And then the judge will make the final decision, right? Or you would at least know what terms and conditions are needed or necessary. You know, I think about a case that involved my cousin. He would have been my second cousin. And my first cousin died when she was 35 of breast cancer. Her mother died when she was about 30, right around the same time, 36, 37 of breast cancer. And my Aunt Brenda left two kids, Waverly and Chris. And my Aunt Brenda, when she was sick, ended up marrying a man she had met in the hospital. And after she died, he remarried his then wife, his ex-wife, and moved her into my aunt's house with her children and put my aunt's children out in the street, which then caused my first cousin, Chris, to go into like a group of people. I'm not going to say gang because I don't know if it was a gang, but they were just certainly a group of friends. And he ended up getting incarcerated for armed robbery. But before he was incarcerated, he had a little boy who was named after him, who was also Chris. And Chris grew up and he then had a baby, a little girl. And he had nobody. His grandmother's dead. His aunt is, dead. His father is incarcerated and he has this little girl. And whatever happened between the two of his daughter's mother and him, they would not let him see the baby. And it was making him crazy. And he would ask people for help and he didn't understand, like you go get a lawyer and you go to court and you get custody. And the girl and her family just kept saying, you're never going to see this baby. You're never going to see this baby. But I do believe that he had a love for his child and he wanted to see her. And he would constantly try to go see her. And every time he would go see her, they would either be very rude, call the police, or they would beat him up or abuse him. And one day he showed up and he said, I want to see my baby. It's my baby. I have the right to see the baby. And they beat him up and they threw him out. And he came back and he shot everyone.
Wow.
Okay. So people have breaking points.
Sure.
People have breaking points.
Absolutely.
And so what we don't want to see is people in community getting to those breaking points. And so as a community, we have to be aware of things people can do to cause people to break. And what we can do as prosecutors and the defense bars, we can talk about those things so that we make sure that people are not receiving sentences or punishment that is so severe that it just makes no sense for this individual. Whether that's in a self-defense case, whether that's in a, people always say your back is against the wall and you have no choice kind of situation, or whether it's in a case where you have someone who just doesn't have the right guidance and they really don't know how to make the right decision because they were never taught how to make the right decision. But what we don't want are people losing their life to prisons and jails. I don't want to see young people just wasting away in spaces where people don't care about them. Because if you're in a space where nobody cares about you, there's no ability for you to do right or get better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. With regard to accountability, for correctional officers, and I'm going to go to two high-profile cases. One is Shakobi King, whose mother was right here in the studio earlier this morning. And the community, first of all, the young man could have been out on bail. That's one, right? He was there and he had mental health challenges for sure. And the footage was only released because it was released and it wasn't, but the surveillance that's in there is not, this was a situation that it leaked to the community. But the culture of violence, the culture of abuse, the culture of death, the culture of sexual assault as a district attorney, how would you address correctional officers if a person is in custody and care and their life is taken and they get to come back to work the next day? And then you talk about, and then they come back into community and actually threaten people who say what you did was wrong. How would you address that? What's the accountability measures for correctional officers who have custody and care that are abusing that power?
So one of the things we have to do is if you see it, you have to say something, because just because you're in law enforcement doesn't mean you have the right to abuse the position that you hold. And it certainly doesn't mean you have the right to abuse the people in your care. There are cultures that exist. And so, how the framework within those cultures, how do we dismantle them? Part of it is people having the courage, right, to speak up. But once they do speak up, that people like me, if I am the seated district attorney, also have the courage to have their back when they speak up. Because it's not enough to tell someone you have to speak up and you take on an entire system if you're there then standing alone. You have to have people speak up. And when we ask people to speak up, then we need to make sure that we have the measures in place, the resources in place, and the ability to protect them. And that's with anything, whether it's a victim, a witness, a survivor of domestic violence. You can't ask them to do something if you have no ability to protect them. You get to go home and they got to figure out where they're going to be tonight. That's not the way it goes. And so one of the things I do want to do is work in community and collaboratively with programs that can be safe spaces, programs that can provide the necessary support, whether, because support is different. It's either temporary support and then you need more long-term support. But we do have to make sure that individuals, if they are incarcerated, they have the ability to transition back into community. That takes a lot more than just, saying, have a nice day. And as some people would think, that takes a lot more than just giving someone an identification card. You have to give them resources. And if you think about it, we do it in different ways in different spaces. So for example, it's no different than for a child that's in high school. We line up and try to figure out what internship programs they can do. Well, my position is, if you have someone incarcerated for 2.5 years, shouldn't they just be doing an internship program during that time? Isn't there any skill-based thing we can give them to do? Because I can think of a lot of things, like we could teach people second languages. We could teach people how skills, I remember my uncle was serving a life sentence, and he would always send home beautiful, small leather goods, where he was an expert at making belts and wallets. And I mean, better than a Coach belt or a Coach wallet.
Sure.
And so I just feel like, there are skills people can have, and there's industry that we can bring in. One program that I really like is the program where you take and you allow the inmates to work and train, whether it's a comfort dog or or a dog that helps people who have a disability, or a dog that helps people who have a seizure. But there's also a huge need for companion canines or dogs, right? Who help children with autism. Because you have to remember, some children who have certain disabilities, they don't have the ability to speak.
Correct.
And so the dog is a way that it can be trained, and it can help them go back out into community and be safe, and also, give them a layer of protection.
I love that. Another high profile case really quickly is the Stevenson King Jr. case, right? And again, this is not typical that a district attorney charges a police officer with manslaughter. Now, granted, there are people who are behind the wall, whom are there for dangerousness hearings, and they start with second degree and have to work your way down. And so I'd just be curious to hear your perspective about many people were asking. Even for that to happen, the body camera footage must have been compelling. And so the city council unanimously voted for that body footage to be released, and it was not released.
Well, I mean, I didn't see the tape, and I wasn't invited to any meeting. I mean, they've had a bunch of meetings. No one's asked me to look at anything. But, they also said the body cam footage was compelling and convicted Karen Reed. And we saw that body cam footage where she's running around going, I killed him, I killed him, I killed him. And it's that footage that brings her before a judge in a court charged with first-degree murder, right? My thing is, the body cam footage, whether it's right or wrong, it doesn't show everything.
Okay.
And so, and I don't even know what Karen Reed's final charge was. I watched the case a little, and the whole world seemed to be watching it except for me. But I remember watching the video, and I remember thinking that the way the video was framed, and when I listened to it, it sounded like to me she was responding to something that was said.
Okay.
Right. And so I don't know what this particular body cam shows, but I do know that it doesn't show it all. Mm-hmm. And then the other element to anything is the human element, right? So I remember, talking to people, if you talk to people in sports, for example, they'll talk about putting together the perfect team. They can put together any stat, any statistic, they can look at any number, they can look at any data. But the one thing they can't do is tell you how it will work based on the human element. Mm-hmm. And the human element to it is that people are human and people react differently under stress. Sure. And people respond differently to stress. Sure. And so until we see all of it, right? All the angles, all the footage, a frame by frame, and we get all the information, it's hard to know who's right and who's wrong. But there is a process for that, right? And that process is to submit it to the grand jury. The grand jury is interesting, right? Because what people don't realize is this. People say, oh, it was indicted. They went to the grand jury. But the grand jury gets everything. They get things that the jury will never hear or see, right? So the grand jury can get hearsay. It can get opinions that may or may not be applicable in a trial. At that time, there's no motions filed. The defense has no say really in those proceedings. And so the criminal justice system is awkward in that sense, where you can receive an indictment and you can literally have your life turned upside down, as we saw in the Karen Reed space. And the jury could still come back and say you were not guilty, right? But in the eyes of public opinion, it could go either way. And it's all how a person sees the information. And I remember, witnessing my first murder in Roxbury and, being detained by the detectives to give my statement, but also being on the street and hearing the other people around me giving their statements and saying what they saw. And it was interesting, like standing there and listening to people give their eyewitness account and how different the accounts were.
Sure.
And so I think even